Well, the kegs have been killed and the red Solo cups are all over the floor and the last dance has been danced. The party's over at the Education Department, says Linda McMahon. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. This episode of Right Angles brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, Secretary of Education Linda McMahon has announced that the COVID-era student loan deferments that have been stretched out long past the COVID era are over, and people who have borrowed money to pay for their college education are now being expected to pay for their college education. Stephen Green, there were some striking stats in a column she wrote for the Wall Street Journal, that is Secretary McMahon, that she said that the deferments promised, first of all, COVID-era deferments, followed by promises of forgiveness by President Biden that were struck down by the Supreme Court, caused the amount owed to on student loans to balloon by $60 billion a year from 2021 to 2024. She said the Education Department has manipulated repayment plans, resulting in only 38% of student loan portfolio of the student loan portfolio being repaid. So most student loans outstanding are not being repaid, and a bunch of them because of promises made by the Biden administration and COVID-era deferments that were stretched long beyond the era. Steve, I'm trying to see both sides of this situation. Is it possible that Biden's student loan deferment and these promises of forgiveness on these loans could have provided some necessary relief to borrowers who were facing real economic hardship? And honestly, what risk does Linda McMahon run by pushing for immediate repayment? What risk could that cause to these people who were so put upon by these loans?
Well, let's get this back to the foundation here. Scott, do you remember co-signing anybody's student loan?
No.
I didn't co-sign anybody's student loan. And what President-ish Biden did by deferring these payments on this taxpayer-secured program was to put you and me and everybody watching this program on the hook for somebody else's loan that we never co-signed. And like so many of the idiot, stupid, wrong-headed things we do these days, this goes back to Barack Obama, who federalized the student loan program. And he did that for a couple of reasons. One, if you've got easy money, prices go up. Home prices ballooned during cheap interest rates, and now we're trying to work that out of the system now that interest rates are higher again. And the same thing happened with student loans. You've got these federally guaranteed loans. That means taxpayer, you and me, guaranteed loans. And that took a bad situation, the accelerating increase in the cost of a college education, and it made it worse, which is fine for Obama and the Democrats because that meant more money going to their allies in the education system and in the higher ed system. And it also made student loans into a federal benefit, which means that there is largesse to be distributed to various interest groups who will then support you come election day. And so this has just introduced all kinds of moral hazard and just bad decision making into what should be something pretty simple. Number one, the federal government has no business securing these loans because that's our money they're playing with for other people's benefit. The other is, if anybody's going to secure these loans, it ought to be the universities themselves. They need to have skin in the game for a couple of reasons. One, they'll stop peddling degrees that aren't worth as much as they cost. That would be very nice. And the other reason for that is it will put downward pressure on the price of a university education. And we have got to do that because these costs are out of control. Once again, thanks to the fact that Uncle Sam has his hand in your wallet.
Bill Whittle, I'm trying to think of this from beyond the personal level that Steve and I just discussed on a more national level. Is it possible that student loan forgiveness, as President Biden tried to, it turns out illegally, unconstitutionally push through, as well as extending the deferments, all of that, couldn't that stimulate economic growth in the economy because the money that would have otherwise gone to paying back student loans now goes to whatever people want to spend that money on. And wouldn't it be worthwhile for Secretary McMahon to back off and say, you know what, it's not the government has enough money, we can float this. Why don't we let that money keep pouring into the real economy?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm not an economist. I play one on the internet. This sounds to me a bit like the broken windows fallacy, which basically says something. If you want to create a lot of work, well, all you have to do is just go around and smash all the windows in town and think of all the money that will be spent repairing those windows. Window repair guys who would normally be, maybe having a quiet afternoon would suddenly be fully employed. So all we have to do is smash all the windows around town, and all of these people will get into the window repair business, and then think of all the money we'll generate. The fundamental flaw in this reasoning is if you're busy repairing broken windows, you're not installing any new windows. It's a version of the sunk cost fallacy. You're basically saying that money. I'm sorry, that's not the sunk cost fallacy. It's the other fallacy. But basically, what I'm basically saying is, you could make that case, but a much better case to be made would have been, what could that money have done if it had not been spent down this pathway? What could that money have accomplished? I think the thing that's most striking about this is it looks like that for the first time in their lives, Gen Z, who didn't ask to be raised themselves, by the way, I constantly need to point that out when I criticize Gen Z. They did not set their own, parenting and educational standards. But it looks like for the first time, they're going to have to actually face some accountability and start making some student loan payments, which means they're going to have to cut back on other things that they like to do. Now, I had to, Steve was talking about co-signing loans. I had to get my student loan co-signed because I was a snot-nosed, 18-year-old kid going to college, and somebody responsible had to be responsible for me paying back those loans. It was practically 40 years ago when I got out of college. Now, needless to say, I did pay those loans off. I wrote the last check in February, I think it was. But in any event, if you forgive these loans, you will be putting in yet another data set for this entire two generations saying that they are not responsible for things that they agree to, that they can break a contract, that they if they just complain enough or howl enough or whine enough or wait long enough, they will never have to repay their obligations. And so that begs the question of, even if you were to say that you could make the case for writing off these loans, what does that tell you about how they're going to go into businesses of their own? What does that tell you about their ability to judge risk and financial reward if everything that they've ever done, every bad decision that they've ever made, has been suddenly deemed to be immune from consequences? You took out $200,000 so that you could study studies programs, engineering studies. You're not an engineer. You just study engineering as a means of the patriarchy. You're going to get a $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year job teaching studies to other people going into the factory, and you're not going to produce anything of value. Meanwhile, our friend Mike Rowe has something called Mike Rowe Works. It's MikeRoweWorks.org, which is basically offering scholarships because there's about 7 million unemployed young men and an almost identical number of tech jobs that need to be filled. And he's got a foundation that's offering scholarships to young men, and they have to sign, mostly young men, they have to sign a pledge that says that hard work is the basis of not only of an economy, but of personal happiness. And these are the steps that I will do in order to repay this scholarship. And this is the future. The people who get degrees in gender studies don't belong in college. I'm not saying they're too stupid to be in college, but I am saying they're too lazy to be in college. And I can speak to this with some authority because I was a theater major, and I had some friends who were engineering majors, and their studying was a lot harder than mine was. A lot harder.
Well, I, for one, treasure my degree in ology, And I found it has stood me in good stead in all the vacuous things I've done in my life. The interesting thing here is anytime we discuss, or anybody discusses this whole idea of student loans and whether they should be paid back and how fast they should be paid back and how much of it should be paid back, we wind up talking about the people who borrow the money. But the real beneficiaries in this situation, as my colleagues have hinted, is the university system. And these are not poor people who are desperate for money. These are rather well-off people who found that if the federal government will backstop loans to your store, let's call it, to your business, that you can raise your prices because the long-term cost of the education is cheaper because you don't have to pay interest or high interest on the dollars. So if the government will issue grants, if the government will help to subsidize low-interest loans, if the government will say at some point, look, we know that was only a 5, 6, 7% interest loan, but you don't have to pay it back at all, or we'll let you milk that out over the next 40 years, taking your time to pay that back, then that allows the cost of the product to escalate incrementally and eventually exponentially over time. So the real beneficiaries are the colleges and universities that have lobbied the government as if it was on behalf of the poor kid from Baltimore who would just, if he could only get a chance to go to college, could make something of himself. And that's who we're encouraged to look at instead of the university, which could educate that kid for free and not even notice that he had passed through the system because it wouldn't affect their bottom line whatsoever. And in fact, a lot of universities, including places like Harvard, have endowments that are so large that they could run in perpetuity into the future, offering free tuition to everybody and see no diminution of their ability to educate people if they decide to start educating people. But anyway, so the key is here that Linda McMahon is basically saying, look, the era of accountability is back. The Biden administration made a mistake, and Congress made a mistake for extending the COVID era deferments. And President Biden gave an unconstitutional impression that people were going to be forgiven for those loans. The result, as you can see, is 38% of loans being repaid and a ballooning at $60 billion a year increase. Let me make sure I said million versus billion, $60 billion annually for those years. Of increased debt on the books not being paid back for a product that's already been used. You can't recall somebody's college education like you can somebody's car or house if they fail to pay back the loan. So what I'm seeing from Secretary McMahon is just common sense. It's just doing her job. It shouldn't raise an eyebrow. It shouldn't even require an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and it should have happened years ago. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.